If you work in rehabilitation and performance, you know that recovery from injury often looks different for everyone. But generally, the process starts with the same two questions. What's really going on and what will actually help? This season on Recover, Perform, Excel, the Performance and Rehabilitation podcast from Kiko Health, we follow those questions through the key stages of recovery with the help of our clinically esteemed guests and their expert insights. Firstly, we'll explore what diagnostic ultrasound can reveal. Next, how the right treatment, training load and recovery strategies can keep our people moving and keep the players on the pitch. And finally, link theory to practice when combining the world of academia and sport, discussing what is truly linking research to practice. Less guesswork, more evidence, and the practitioners putting the tools to work. Recover, Perform, Excel. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Recover, Perform and Excel podcast with me, John Hartley and Kiko Health. Today, we're very lucky and fortunate to have Dave Carolan, the man himself. Over 30 years experience in elite professional sport. We've just been having a little chuckle off camera about your history there, Dave, and the clubs. But yeah, going back to the days of Norwich, through Colchester, Birmingham, Derby, Millwall, Stoke, and then obviously onto pastures new with UEFA, FIFA, obviously a history with the FA. Look, we've a lot to talk about today. So do you want to start us off roughly at the beginning and you getting into sport for everyone who's sort of listening and getting into the world that you're in? I guess what stimulated you at that point, really? What was well, we probably all know what the appeal is because we all felt the same. But yeah, just sort of share a little bit about your journey, mate, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for the invite to come on and speak about, the experiences I've had. And I suppose I echo probably everybody else who works in professional sport or wants to, is that, you grew up with a love of sport. Somewhere along the line, somebody gave them some inspiration to think, sport is fun and it's good to be around. And as you get into it and you have more experiences, you find out you might be good at sport. And then that opens a different kind of pathway for you, because now it's not just about, well, what sport should be about, isn't it? It's about fun and enjoyment and potentially being with other people and improving yourself. But then also, if you have a competitive gene, it gives you a chance to then, really stretch that. And that's probably what happened to me. I got into football just literally off a chance day in 1982 where we were at the beach and somebody said, "Do you want to come and watch some of the World Cup?" And we're just about to start the World Cup. And I didn't know really anything about football. I was doing athletics and all the kind of stuff at school, but I wasn't really into football. And I ended up going into a room, and the first game of football I ever saw, which is a thing that some people say they can remember the first stadium they went to, but I can remember the first game, and it was the iconic Brazil-Italy game from 1982. So what a game to get you started with. And that was, for me, then that was the seed sown. I thought this could be fun. So then, years later, then I had a bit of a pivot, because back in Ireland, where I'm from, you play Gaelic football, you play soccer, you're doing all of these kind of things. But I had a real interest in rugby, and I ended up becoming quite good at that. And then that kind of, between playing 3 or 4 sports all at the same time, you're getting fitter, you're getting stronger, but also you realized actually you enjoyed playing with better players. And therefore, I'm from a family of educators. I'm from a family of people who are in sport, not competitively, not professionally, but, people who were like into their sport. So that sowed the seed for me. There was education there, there was sport. I didn't want to be a PE teacher. I've always found it difficult to cope with the mentality of people who are just, going to mess about when there's a PE lesson. And I thought, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life dealing with those kind of characters.
Well, you say that, but we well know there's a good few characters in the world of elite sport. And I think just to strap the listeners in a little bit, we've got 44 years to get through now between 1982 and where we sit today. So this could be a long podcast. So strap in, guys. It might be a lot.
So that was it. It was suddenly into, right, I want to work in competitive sport. I want to work in pro sport. If I can't play it, I want to work with those people. And it was off to university, and then very quickly getting around people who are of a similar ilk. And then it's a case of trying to get ahead of them as well as to get to the people who are working in the sport. So, yeah, my background's rugby, and then in 1998 I pivoted into football, and I've been there ever since.
Yeah, and like you say, you've I guess given the time that you've spent in sport, you've been fortunate then enough to travel to different clubs, see different levels of the sport as well, and also not just football. Like if we go back to, I guess, the IS bits or those aspects where you've had exposure in different worlds. I think sometimes, having been in football predominantly, that's most of my career, obviously rugby league as well, but you kind of get stuck in one sport. Yeah. So I guess you've seen those different bits, and I guess now working, and again we can go into a little bit of detail of that, working outside of the realms of full-time football, where when you're in it, you're always a bit worried to come out because it's the fear of the unknown. But do you want to give us then a little insight into some of your experiences outside the world of full-time football, and potentially through the course of this podcast, we might sort of jump into living in the world of football to sort of looking at it and manage it from the outside? Because obviously you're doing some really interesting things at the moment.
I've had a little break from football once before. I mean, a forced break in terms of I decided I was going to do something else. And I suppose that's always an itch, as you rightfully say. People are concerned when they're in professional sport that they don't want to be outside of it. But I think when you've done it for a long time, you also then want to see what's over the fence and see what life there could be like. So I went to work for a company called Edge 10, who are providing athlete management systems to, major leagues. It wasn't necessarily clubs, although we did work with organizations and specific clubs, but we were dealing with league-wide deals, especially in the US. So I was seeing sport from a different angle. I was seeing what all the great practitioners and the great organizations were doing behind the scenes, and supporting those people and doing their work, which is, again, a great new way of, I suppose, stretching yourself, because you're suddenly seeing, yourself, you rarely see behind the curtain of another practitioner or another organization. There's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on, but I was fortunate to be able to get access to see what was going on in these organizations, which again, meant when I always had the itch that was never fully scratched. And that's why I ended up going back into football, because I was still kind of mid-40s, although, yeah, I'll do the jokes on how old I look. But
it's always nicer to be probably the younger one out of the podcast, you know what I mean? Because my world at the moment, I'm still surrounded by, young football players, and you just think sometimes you feel like a little bit of an old man, don't you? But no, it's nice to be the young one for a change.
Yeah, well, people who are probably watching this probably won't believe that, but
listening. To look at, you're probably right, mate. Yeah.
But yeah, going back in, scratched the itch, and I really enjoyed the next kind of 7 or 8 years after coming out of Edge 10. But now, leaving Derby, whatever it is, just almost exactly a year ago now, it was because I wanted to go, and I now want to try other things. I don't think whether it's full-time or consultancy back in football clubs is behind me, because I have been continuing that. But this is a new way for me to take all of the experiences that I've had working with lots of players and coaches, and especially the backroom staff, colleagues, whether it's in medical or performance or analytics and analysis or wherever, to be able to help the future leaders in those fields develop, and support them on that journey. And it also gives me a new stimulus to learn myself, as a kind of lifelong learner. You want to find a way of also stretching yourself to try and continually get better. But it's always been a vocation of mine to try and give back as well, because there's a lot of people in sport who take, but there's less who want to give something back and repay the kind of opportunities we've had.
I feel the same as well, mate. Sometimes, like a big part of one of my roles now is obviously communicating backwards and forwards with clubs and supporting clubs through, looking after players. And it's when you have those conversations at, to academy physios or to, even some first team physios somewhere, that we know what elite football is like from the outside looking and think, oh, it must be fantastic. It must be amazing. I mean, the amount of work that goes in by staff is phenomenal. And then having those conversations to hand players back to clubs, or to, when they're handing them back over and go, look, I'm just not sure about this, or have you ever experienced this, or guidance. And it's not saying that any of us have all the answers, because as you just said, we clearly don't, particularly you and I. But to be able to give some guidance to those staff, I find it like a really, really rewarding bit now. And I'm really enjoying that sort of coming out of full-time football, full-time sport myself, and with a club, and those other aspects of our, we've had support through our career and being able to provide that back to other people now. I find that actually one of the more rewarding bits, rather than worrying about a match day or a couple of match days every week. So no, it's good. But I mean, even with that, like I say, again, I don't know how much you can go into detail, but obviously some of the things that you're doing now, some of the things that you're working with the FA, with UEFA, with FIFA, you've got obviously other things on the go as well, constantly plate spinning. But
just over here spinning plates all the time. Yeah.
How is it working for? I mean, look, some of those names that we just mentioned are phenomenally massive institutions. How is that in comparison to being in a club, if you like?
I mean, obviously those badges are big heavyweight badges, but when you're brought in to do work and you have the privilege of being asked to do some work with them, you realize that you are a very small cog in a giant machine, and the roles that I'm doing there are challenging. They're forward facing, they're looking to the future, well beyond the horizon of probably what I've seen a lot of organizations really looking at, so that for me was a big reason. I think I was asked to be involved because I've always been trying to be an innovator. I've always tried to push the boundaries of what we can do in terms of the work that we do and the processes that we use to do that work. But again, reflecting on how do we support people of the future? Well, we need to provide them with the programs and the insight and the opportunities to stretch themselves. So within the FIFA work, I'm part of the technical leadership department, and some of the work that they're doing in terms of the technical leadership diploma, for example, is groundbreaking on how it's stretching the people who are leading organizations and leading member associations across the world. And that's from the tiniest member association where it'll be an island potentially in the middle of the Pacific, all the way up to, the giant confederations and the member associations, like, for example, in UEFA, who are highly experienced, very affluent, and have a really established ecosystem of coach education and development of their football programs. So even if you look at technical leadership department sits within global football development. And then within that, you've got the talent development scheme. So you'd suddenly realize just how big FIFA is. And outside of the World Cup, which obviously everyone's going to be watching as we're about to start that, there's so much work that goes on around the world to help a kid like me when I was 8 get the opportunity to play football. And that's for the whole world. And you then realize that when, you work within FIFA or within UEFA, where I'm working with the fitness advisory group, which is helping to nurture and develop the education and the people who are going to be delivering in that kind of domain that I've specialized in for so long. But now I get the opportunity to go and help loads of other countries, loads of other practitioners. And my work with the FA is actually as a coach educator with them. So I'm kind of stratified now all the way from, the work at FIFA, the work at UEFA, the work at the FA, and then my own personal work as well that I spin plates doing as well.
Yeah, spinning plates is the key, isn't it? I mean, I saw a fantastic advert the other day, and it was about, it was for a car company. And the car company advertisement was like a young boy going in to see the car and, not being sort of thrown out the door, getting this sort of like you said, that inspiration in that moment. And it concludes him sort of saying, right, well, can I take your card and I'll see you in 20 years when I can get to the level to get this car sort of thing. And I guess for you, putting those things in place is trying to go, well, look, as you were inspired, as I was inspired when we were younger, to kind of go, well, I've seen this, I want to be part of it. How do I get there? And then obviously a big part of that is education and development. So to go through that structured process for people can get them then through the door and, as it were in the advert, buy the car and get to the finish line.
Absolutely that, and we don't know when we go to games and you're on the pitch and you just don't know if there's a little boy or a little girl who's watching you potentially deliver a warm-up or run on the pitch and, treat a player, that isn't the seed that's sown with them to think, I want to do that, and that's why I think it's always been important to not only be a good role model, but be a good mentor, because eventually those people come through and they want to know that their first rung on the ladder, or even when they're on the ladder and they want to climb it a little bit more, that there's supportive people out there. It's not that the whole of the industry needs to be super competitive and therefore, cutting each rung away from below them as they rise up. So yeah, I think that's incumbent on everyone who works in the industry, but there's probably fewer than we probably would hope who are really, reaching their hand below to try and pull people up with them, and provide that opportunity. And as long as the people do it in the right way, that when help is offered, when mentorship is offered, when advice is offered, it's somebody who's essentially offloading or sharing a lot of their experiences potentially for free to give you an opportunity, and that should be appreciated as well.
So I guess going back to, obviously the world's slightly different now as it was, and I guess things you've seen and done a lot since the days of the Strawberry Hill practice manager role. You go going back in the day.
My God, I didn't think that's a couple of pages deep, that one.
Well, look, I do my best to do some research. That's all I can say. But I guess when looking at sort of the challenges that you've faced, let's try and split this into obviously, because a lot of people that listen to this will be on, I guess, at the coalface, if you like, delivering the things that we've delivered in the past and gone through, and what these things sort of depending on the environment that you're in. But what were some of sort of the biggest challenges that you faced then? I guess in sport, if we talk about being at a club, and then if you don't mind just giving us a bit of insight into what the most challenging things are given the current things that you're doing. And that might be personal things, that might be, look, you've found this difficult because it's new, we all do new things. But I guess thinking about the club aspect at first, what were sort of some of the biggest challenges of you going into a club? Look, because like I say, there's been a few and you've visited a few of them twice as well. What are some of those challenges? When you step into a club, what are the sort of the biggest challenges you have to think about and overcome?
Well, if I look at the industry as a whole, when we were starting, or when I was starting, certainly in the mid-90s, really, there was no industry, Okay, medicine was probably in place. Every club, every rugby club, every football club had a physio. How qualified some of them were, because obviously the FA had kind of started to move towards having, qualified physios, but there were still plenty of people who were doing that kind of football first aid almost, or, yeah, you'll probably remember more what the qualification was.
I'd forgotten until you sort of mentioned it then when I look back to when I first started at Blackburn Rovers, and you go, look, the sports science support was 2 days a week from Nick Broad, who I've mentioned before in sort of his podcast, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but like 2 days, and Nick was a nutritionist, really, and that was his area of expertise, and that was the sports science support. And when you think about that now, and that was 2000 when I started at Blackburn, to where we are now, 25, 26 years later, whatever, a quarter of a century, it's a phenomenal difference, isn't it?
100%. And that was both a challenge and an opportunity, because there was no industry. So therefore we could start and almost do whatever. And we could not quite play, but we could make mistakes and nobody would know there were a mistake, because who was telling you that it was a mistake? Everyone else who was starting, I started at Norwich in 98, but even when I was at London Irish in like 95, 96, we were trying stuff. And I often use this kind of analogy of we were essentially slash and burn through a jungle, which was, we just stepped on the shore and we've got to find our way to some form of civilization. And obviously we're there now.
That's quite a nice way of putting it. Yeah, like it's into the unknown, isn't it?
Yeah, and you'd cut down a few, more branches and suddenly it would start opening up a little bit more. And we had to gain acceptance from a lot of people from the sports science point of view. Okay, some of the physios probably were doing fitness as well, because they were seen to be knowledgeable about the body, which, most of you are. But, you had old school coaches and you had physios who were certainly kind of, the physios were trying to help the managers not break the players an awful lot. And most of the coaching staff back there were based on handed down kind of sessions that that players had done with previous managers and previous coaches. And that was the kind of, you know, the passing down of knowledge was done in that way. Whatever Brian Clough did, Martin O'Neill did. Whatever Martin O'Neill did, Paul Lambert did. And, you know, that kind of handing down of knowledge. But then as we started to come in, we had to convince the medics, we had to convince the coaches, we had to convince the players that this whole new sports science thing could actually benefit them. And of course, it was easy with some of the stuff like nutrition, because that was an easy, potentially quick win, you know, in terms of go in and say, don't eat steak and chips, you know, the night before a game.
That's where I've been going wrong all my career. I knew I could have made it if we'd just sorted something out.
That's just for the players, not for the staff, I'll reiterate. But, you know, we were suddenly starting to ask them to lift Olympic weights, put a heavy squat bar on their back and start to build some, you know, kind of core general strength. And that was met with a lot of resistance. And, you know, there was plenty of conversations and media pieces written about, you know, Alan Shearer saying, you know, I did weights, I got slower, weights make you slow. And you only need a player like that to potentially dumb down another 4 years of development, because it's a quick soundbite, but suddenly it kills it. But over the years, I think the work we did early was, you know, create a pathway. More people followed behind. It made a roadway, and now it's a motorway. You know, it's every discipline that I had to cover when I started, which was, you know, I had to do all the strength conditioning. I had to do all of the nutrition. I had to do it for the whole club. I was into sports science. Each of those roles is now its own discipline, and it's multiple levels of that discipline. So we can look back and go, well, we know where it started. Most of the practitioners today have benefited from the work that loads of colleagues have done in creating those opportunities for them, and the fights that were fought, the opportunities that have been opened up for a whole series of disciplines to suddenly come into light. Like, you know, obviously more recently we've got data science, which is now its own dedicated
own little
department within the club. You know, we were guys with Excel, or, you know, not even Excel, trying to count stuff.
I mean, those are obviously the challenges, and how much it's transformed as we've gone forward. I guess stepping into the unknown then, in your current roles and current bits that you're doing, what are those sort of big challenges that you're facing now? And is that a professional thing, or is that a personal thing, or how is that?
I think for anyone who's worked inside the game, you know, there's the regularity of working at a club, you know, where, you know, you've got routine, haven't you? You know, the fixture list will come out. You can plan your next 11 months, you know exactly where you're going to be pretty much on any single day, what your day's going to look like, and, you know, what the plan's going to be. And there's an awful lot of probably comfort in that.
Yeah, I probably didn't realize how much comfort there was in that until you come out of that and you think, hang on a minute, I pretty much had a rough idea. Don't get me wrong, you're there a lot, but you know what you're doing.
And that is probably one of the benefits of working inside a football club all the time is, you know, routine and predictability. But that's also one of the drawbacks. And as you say, nowadays, it's like at least probably a 5 to 6 day a week, probably closer to 6 days a week now, which is obviously having additional challenges for people who work in the game, because it's like, well, where do I get to see my family and have some personal time? You know, so as the game's developed, not everything that's come in has benefited everybody, you know, and especially on the medical side, you know, the challenges are real, aren't they? You know, you have to provide 24/7, 365 care to players and potentially to staff. And that's just an expectation. Now, one level away in the performance world, we may not have those same challenges all the time. You know, we're not necessarily feeling the call at 10:30 at night for a player who's suddenly ill, you know, because that's been offshored to the medical department. Those kind of bits are great and also challenging. You flip it and you come out into the world where I now live in, where I'm like multiple level consulting with different organizations, trying to develop your own business, trying to develop other businesses that you've had, you know, so I've had an app business as well. And you're trying to move all these things, and it's suddenly, right, where am I dedicating time to whichever project? And also, for example, I'll be traveling with UEFA in about a week's time for a week, and I've got to fit in all the other consulting times around that. So how does that work? So that's the challenge of working for yourself, though, isn't it? You know, you have to be pretty organized and there's only you that's responsible for that. You can't just kind of blame it on the manager or blame it on, the sporting director if you so wish to say, oh, that's why I'm not there.
Yeah, and I guess alongside these, and we should probably, not shy away from the fact you're a much more experienced podcast host and podcaster than I am, with your own, obviously, again, your own app, if you like, your own podcast show and things like that. So you're obviously very, very busy in that sense and juggling all those things. So I guess
People called me busy over the years, yeah, for different reasons, I think.
But look, this is the world we live in, isn't it? And I think, when you talk about that consistency at a club where you kind of know what you're doing day in, day out, and don't get me wrong, it changes, doesn't it? It changes at the whim of potentially a good result, a bad result, the mood of the manager, and we all have danced along to the merry tune over the years in that sense. But I guess from a Kiko Health point of view, and the things that Kiko deliver, supporting and around, high level quality equipment of producing and monitoring like objective markers, things like isokinetic dynamometry, things like force plates. I guess from a diagnostic, probably more medical point of view, ultrasound scanners and those types of things. But I just wondered if there was any sort of tools, probably more, your background as more sort of sports scientist, strength and conditioning, that kind of world, a bit more than my world of, the physio and the medical side of things. I guess an insight from you as to like some of the tools or some of the structures that you've put in place to either through the rehab process and overseeing that, or even just maintaining and monitoring fit athletes. What are sort of some of the most useful bits of technology, I suppose, that you've found in your world that have been, I mean, obviously there's going to be, we're going to touch on GPS here, but, and myths and beliefs or positives for those things. But, I just wonder if you can give us a bit of a structured insight into the things that you've found really useful along the way for sort of practitioners that might be just starting out in the journey that we've done in the past. But, if it'd be great if you give us a bit of insight into that.
Yeah, well, if I go right back to the start, when I was at university, we had a Cybex 2 isokinetic dynamometer. So for those of you who've probably never seen one, you'll struggle to find a picture of it on the internet. You can find a lot on the web.
For those that are keen, that's now evolved into the Hugh Norm, which is obviously a company that Kiko worked with.
One of the first pieces of equipment I ever worked with in my career was an isokinetic dynamometer, and that was where I started to realize, okay, the use of technology in a really good way can be really beneficial, not only just for me in terms of assessment of an athlete and getting a better understanding of where they are in terms of, say, strength in the case of that, but then you start expanding into other areas and you've seen how it's developed, so you've gone from, I remember having, we would do assessments with the London Irish players, I'd have to count each individual square on graph paper to be able to work out what the actual...
I've forgotten about that. We've spoken about this before, haven't we? Because obviously my background is a little bit, obviously, I've kind of always used isokinetics through my career. And then we were chuckling about this. I'd totally forgot that we'd had that conversation of like counting the little squares to basically measure the area under the curve. It sounds crazy now, doesn't it?
With a dial, so as somebody would kick out, you were trying to look at the dial that was kind of shaking as it was like, oh, that looked like 250 Newton meters, but it also might have been one of the other ones. I think we're on foot pounds.
Yeah, foot pounds.
Not
good days.
But you were like foot pounds and Newton meters, and then depending on who you were talking to as a physio, like they were also dealing with whatever they were comfortable with, because if it was an older physio back then, like in the early 90s, you might be dealing with people who were trained in the 50s or in the 60s who were, used to dealing with foot pounds. So
you're saying Dave used to love his foot pounds, and then it's like, I'm sure we're in Newton meters now, and he's like, well, I still quite like the foot pounds. So again, I should have asked him that when I spoke to him on the podcast that we did with him, but you're still using foot pounds.
Well, the thing that probably taught me as well was, how diligent you had to be, in terms of setting up your equipment, the importance of calibration, the importance of, having a system that is well maintained and well calibrated, because when it comes to testing, you can't afford for the information to be wrong, because you might be making big decisions on the back of that. And they could be career decisions for players, and there could be career decisions for us if we get it wrong. But certainly back then, it was, the equipment was good, but more basic, whereas nowadays, if you look at the real advanced technologies that we're using, whether they're force plates, and there's, I've used Kistler plates in the past. Most people use valve plates at the moment, but again, these are great pieces of technology to get better insights into the athletes that we're working with, and better information informs our processes better, so we can make better decisions with better information, or we hope we can. And that means also that once you've got the information and you're able to process it and then put it into a plan, how well structured is your plan? So, for example, at one of the clubs I went into, they didn't particularly have a good process. They had the equipment, but the process of designing and planning around return to play program from start to finish for a player who gets injured, it was essentially, almost finger in the air every day. What did he do yesterday? Okay, let's do this today. And, there wasn't a structure. So very quickly in my role as kind of overseeing some of those kind of inputs would be, okay, we need to have this better coordinated, better planned, and better objectified, that we can actually look at how well we did in our process. Because let's be honest, you're going to be running the same process for roughly the same injury multiple times over a number of years. So if you're not benchmarking it and having some kind of plan, then it's really difficult for you then to reflect on, well, actually, we did it this way this time and the player came back faster and stayed back. Maybe that's a good way of designing that. Of course, GPS is one of the big technologies that we're all aware of, but it's not everything. It's a great measure of external load and what the player did. But when you look at internal load, you can really see what the effect of that, what the response of that is. So, heart rate monitoring is obviously something that kind of fell away for a long time in a lot of practices, but I've always tried to maintain it through 30 years, because the first practitioners I worked with who mentored me, Joe Dunbar, physiologist, we were doing biomarkers in the 90s. We were using heart rate systems, long before Bolton had come on the scene and decided that they were the mothership for sports science.
You should know better than that. It's not Bolton. It was Big Sam's Bolton at the time.
Oh, sorry, Big Sam's Bolton, yeah. But they did fantastic work, and they probably...
And they did, yeah.
Yeah, if other people were the seed, Ed Baranowski, who was doing work at Blackburn, in the mid-90s, these people were the seed and the fertilizer and the good soil. By the time it got to kind of Big Sam, suddenly it flowered and it became kind of known about. And that was the thing that everybody started looking over the fence and going, oh, they're doing that. Maybe we should all do that. And it suddenly explodes from there. And the one thing they did really well was they were willing to look at anything. They were willing to look at Prozone as a measure of physical output in games, not only the tactical benefits, but also the physical outputs. So we didn't have GPS then, but suddenly we did have this other way of tracking players. So whether it's technology or, you can have as much tech as you want, but if you don't have good people and good processes and good decisions off the back of it, sometimes you're better not having it at all, because it can actually give you a lot of false positives if you put it in the hands of somebody who doesn't really know what they're talking about.
I think one of the key things you said there at the onset really was obviously the structure, the process, the ability to, test, pre and post intervention. Is the program we're putting in place actually doing what we hoped it would do? And you said, like, one place they had the tech, but the bit in between was, not quite a structured process. But you use the word inform, and I thought that was the important part there, where quite often it's like, right, here's the result, this is it, but I think as we get older and hopefully a bit wiser, I'm not sure, but it's informing, it's a piece of the puzzle. Whatever test or whatever measurement we put in place, it should only inform what we see with our eyes also, what other information we bring to the table is. And I think sometimes that potentially gets lost to going, we've done this test, this is information, this is it. And I think, that was the key at the onset of it, like you said, it's to inform our practice, not to dictate our practice because it measured X or Y. And I think sometimes, and again, it'd be good to get your thoughts of, like, do you think that's somewhere where the modern day practitioner might be getting a bit lost at certain times?
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that when you start start reflecting on, say, the scanning culture that we have nowadays. It's like no diagnosis can be made until there's a scan and it's reported on, and that's the diagnosis that we're then going to work from. So talking with colleagues even the last couple of weeks, which is and looking at some of the products that are coming to market, is like, how good are we at diagnosis? How good are we at prognosis?
Are you just trying to sell my PhD here? Because my PhD is in diagnosis and prognosis of hamstring injury. So that I should sign you up. You could be
I
my.
must have listened to you once upon a time.
You,
Then, yeah.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, we only had the one season together, unfortunately. Should have, could have been longer.
Yeah, but I think when you look at those and you think, just because we have all those things, should they be put or given more weight than potentially the human who has 10, 20, 30 years of experience, who actually has got insight in different ways. And, the scan doesn't tell you about the man either, or the athlete or the player as well. We can see some players who will grin and bear it through what in the past would have been maybe a 2B. They would have just gone, oh yeah, I'll be fine, strap it up and get me out.
And you've worked across different sports, so you've seen how different athletes in different sports do that. And likewise, in my time in rugby league, and I think over my shoulder is one of my rugby league shirts there, and it's the way the athlete deals with the problem. Therefore, the return to play time, it is the athlete does influence the return to play time, not just the diagnosis, if you like.
Yeah, and we also have to be cognizant as well of, head coaches and managers are under severe pressure, and our job is to support them as well as the player. We have to respect that our first role is to keep a player healthy, and at a time when there's never been more scrutiny over the work that we do, every week is somebody's having an injury crisis left, right and centre, and there's a pile on in the media and people have been questioned about their professionalism and their ability. So it's moved even away from, it's the manager or the head coach's fault. It's now like, oh, the head of performance must be running a really bad program because all the players are injured. And it can be, well, you don't know how well the pitch has been maintained.
There's multiple factors in it. I don't remember the last time a physio or a doc particularly ran out and injured someone.
There's always a good meme on there of one of them 2-footing a player when he runs on too quick and slips, so,
I think we've both seen that in life as well, by the way. So I guess going back to the objective nature or the objective markers and is this things and sort of in the next section of that we want to sort of jump into is, I guess, myth or method is like, has it been, like as a quick fire bit, has it been things, and there will have been over the time because I'm the same, but is it things that you've come across and someone's tried to sell you this fantastic product or you've taken this fantastic product and then about 3 to 6 months in you've gone, I'm not sure this does what it says on the tin here. Is there anything that you've come across where, and we don't have to name names or specific products, but just to give us a bit of an insight into things where you've gone, I'm not sure I've got the right one here.
It's a great conversation. We reflect on methods and practices that we've done over the years. Like, you'll remember there was a period in the early 2000s where we were suddenly bringing stretch mats onto the pitch so that people could stretch on the pitch on a mat. And I'm like, these guys are going to be rolling around on the pitch in about 10 minutes time. Now, why am I giving them a mat? Even I've always been like, okay, I probably did it a little bit, but the glute band thing, which was, well, we better wake up your glutes. It's like, do glutes go to sleep or something? Like, I'm pretty sure as a human, as how we walk, we have to use our glutes most of the time anyway. But, tongue in cheek, I understood what they were probably trying to do. But I think also we end up, and this is probably a reflection on the industry, which is we're drawn to quick fixes and, deduction down to the simplest form. Things like Gabbitt's acute chronic workload ratio. It's simplified everything down to a number for people. And as you said there, it's far more complex. Human performance, and especially in elite sport, is so complex that, a deductionist or reductionist model to try and just simplify everything, I think does a disservice to us as practitioners, because we should have the level of breadth of thought and depth of knowledge to be able to look at an athlete and actually weigh up all of these different components that surround the player. Is it lifestyle? Is it training method? Is it the coach-athlete relationship? Because it's never just one thing, as we know. It can be one thing if somebody just gets kicked, but it's normally a build-up of a number of things that haven't been appreciated, which ends up in players getting injured. So for me, going back to the kind of main point of your question, I've always done my due diligence on the tech that I bring in, but that doesn't mean I'm also not going to look at innovation and an early adopter methodology, because that could be the one thing that helps your players, helps your team, helps you or your colleagues do your job better, win more, be more successful.
And is there anything that you can remember where you've gone, do you know what, we're going to do this? And then pretty rapidly after you've gone, do you know what, we probably shouldn't have done this? Or have you been one of the more fortunate ones who's not spent thousands of pounds on this machine that you've gone as vibration training platform or something?
I probably haven't been fortunate enough in terms of the budgets that have been available to me at some of the clubs to be able to make expensive mistakes. And therefore, it's not that you go safe and tried and trusted, but you certainly have to make your every pound stretch a little bit further. And therefore, if I'm going to commit to something, I'm going to commit to it hard, but I'm going to ensure that I've done my background work.
I think what you said there, Dave, I said, and that might come as a bit of a shock to people, like one of the comments you just said, in the sense of, if we think about and name some of those clubs, I mean, you've worked at some, good big clubs that you would think, good, Derby, Birmingham, Millwall, Stoke, Norwich, those level of club. And I guess a lot of people from the outside don't realise, looking in, when we think about like the capex, the ability to just go out and buy these products, and people think, well, they're rich football clubs and things. I guess one of the things people sometimes don't realise is that there needs to be some structure to get that equipment in. It's not as easy. Don't get me wrong, some clubs, it might be, if they're building a new gym or a new facility or whatever it might be, they might be the moment where you're able to cash in a little bit. But it's not that straightforward, is it? And I guess people might not realise how difficult it is sometimes to get things.
No, and, while there's a lot of money in football clubs, there's a bucket for players and what they get paid. There's a much smaller but still significant budget on what's going to coaching staff. And then there's the last bucket, which has to be spread across the whole of the rest of the club. And that includes all of the wages for all of the other staff and operations and for capital expenditure, and we're in there fighting with everybody else for a little bit more of the pie that we'd like to use for whatever we want to do. And our clubs have been creative in the last number of years, maybe last 10 years, looking at R&D tax credits to kind of try and help, allow us to fund some of the things that we want to bring in and be innovative with. But even that eventually runs out. There's only so much R&D you're able to continue.
Got to keep recreating the wheel, yeah. And I think that's something we've had big internal discussions here at Kiko about, trying to get access to and provision of care and provision of access to some of the equipment. Because look, like I say, it's not always that easy. And I think that's a good education piece from Kiko Health, where we've really tried to look at that. And I guess even from, before me, working with the guys here, maybe the realization of that wasn't necessarily knowing what went on inside clubs. So hopefully if I've given them nothing else, it's a bit of an insight.
Yeah, and some of the work, I've just set up a new venture called Sport Detector. And one of the things that we're trying to do is bring to clubs and organizations the full horizon of what's available out there. Because we also have to be reflective on the fact that we have potential laziness within the system as well, within professional sport, which is whatever piece of tech I'm using now is the piece of tech I should always use. And therefore we're closed off to looking at what's out there and what's new, or we're waiting for the whole of the industry to have moved forward before we will consider something new that's coming on the market. And I think it does a disservice to our industry if we're not being curious about whether it's a technology, whether it's a way of practicing, whether we're reflective on how we do our job and who we do our job with. Like, do I need to move to a different club to get a different experience if I can, because all of those things, going back to what I said at the start, they're the growth bits that allow you to improve as a practitioner, improve what you do. But it's so often that I've been both sides of the fence. We see how challenging it is for new vendors and new pieces of tech to get into clubs because the guardrails are up straight away, because it's not the fault of any one vendor. It's just because every single one of them is trying to knock on the front door.
We've been there with 10 emails a day from different companies to go, and would you like to try our product? It's difficult, isn't it, when you're in there to be objective and go, okay, because at times, like you say, you do get bombarded where you're in on the inside.
Yeah, and I've got now 520 different vendors and solution providers within the database. If you imagine that, if you even got 3 of those a week, you're going to be 3 of those a week for the next 3 years, and you still won't have got to the end of it. And you think, look, where's the bandwidth? But also, how many lost opportunities are we missing because people have just gone, barriers are up, blinkers are on, I'm not considering. Whereas you should be considering all the time, before I sign this next contract on this next piece of equipment or the same piece of equipment, is there better out there? What should I be taking into the building to challenge that? And that's part of our responsibility, not only to ourselves and the job that we do, but also to the people we work with, to ensure that we have got best in class and what's affordable and available to us. But, that's me on the soapbox.
Yeah, well, I guess, look, coming on to sort of the final section here, and this is sort of a question forward from, because you're the first in this little series, it comes from me, unfortunately, for you. And I'll get one from you from the next person. We all get into this, and I think everyone's role develops, whether that's sports science, physio, whatever it is. To go higher up, you then start drifting away from what we deliver. So for you then, which do you prefer, the strategy and management side of the roles or the delivery side of the roles?
Nasty question. As you get on in your career and you move to more strategy, you move away from the players, you move away from delivery. And there's always a part of you that, that's where you started, and that's what you can go back to do. You get so much enjoyment from working with the players, whatever the banter might be when you slip over and you fall face first into a mannequin. And then it's on 30 TVs inside the training ground within 2 minutes.
Speaking from experience there, Dave.
Yes. And that's the fun side, and that's the human side, and you don't get that from a planning document or an Excel sheet. And that's something I've always encouraged staff that I've worked with, is the players will leave at some stage in the day, and don't waste the opportunity to be with the players because you found a way to be with your laptop or on your phone. The players are there. They want our support. They want to know, it's not, I don't want to use that old phrase about, how much you know and how much you care, but they want you to be present. They want you to be around them and helping them and supporting them and being with them, because that's the connection. And when you move to strategy, you lose that connection a lot of the time because you've got lots of other things that demand your time. But the strategy thing also allows you now to put in place the structures, processes that allow the program as a whole to get better, and the people who work within that to get better. And that can be the players or it can be the practitioners, where you're saying, how can I grow these people to be, hopefully have as, whatever you measure success with, is it longevity, is it trophies, is it the clubs you work at, but whatever you determine success to be in your career.
You're going to cop out here, aren't you, and say, look, obviously you enjoy the delivery bit because we all did, but at times, with experience comes an element of monotony with that, and then you enjoy taking that step back. Am I right in concluding or drawing that's where you're going to sit on the fence for me?
Yes, you are right. I'm going to sit on the fence. But that's because, the joy comes from, like this week alone, and this isn't meant as any kind of braggadocious way, but, I've spoken to 2 or 3 ex-players. I've spoken to 2 or 3 ex-members of staff that I've worked with, because you maintain the connection with them, that hopefully you've grown good relationships with these people. And that's where you want value. And at the end of your days, you want to look back and be able to think, well, I helped people get better at what they did. And if you go into your career with that kind of outlook, you're always going to have an enjoyable career, and success is measured in a different way. It won't be, the size of the house I've got or the car, but I can't bring those with me. And if I leave behind any legacy, is because that you've helped people hopefully be better and get more success in what they did. And that reflects on whether you did a good job or not. And that's my success.
Yeah. So I guess to to sort of bring that to a bit of a close, and I guess your sort of takeaway for Kiko Health and the last segment of this podcast is like, if you could choose one small piece of advice for either, other practitioners or players, or in our case, patients, or however that would be, what would you think they should sort of do more of, less of in their sort of journey through sport and their career?
I've used it on previous podcasts I've been on, but it's to be and stay curious about the work you do, the people that you work with. Find out about what makes people tick. Find out about how you can be better. Never lose that curiosity and what's going on around you. Don't, I probably at one stage in my career, I lost that. I thought I was doing okay, and I blindsided myself. I didn't realize I'd fallen into the trap, and then somebody said something to me, and it was like the kind of slap across your face, which is kind of, oh, stop that. I used to be doing that, and I thought I probably had come from being like 7 or 8 years already doing it, and thought, oh yeah, kind of got comfortable. Stop being curious. And not long after, I'd stopped, I restarted again, but then I lost my job at Norwich, and that was the impetus for, I'm never letting that happen again. And I've said that right up to today now. So yeah, stay curious, be curious.
Perfect. Well, look, Dave, thanks ever so much for your time today. Thanks for coming on and sharing your journey and your insights into sort of your world of sports science and beyond, and everything that you've done in your career. So no, much appreciated. Thanks ever so much. So that's it for this episode of Recover, Perform, Excel. Thank you for listening. If you took something useful from today's conversation, then share it with your team, your colleagues, or anyone in the rehab and performance journey. You can subscribe and find all episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and at kikohealth.com. And if you've got a myth to bust or a method to share, please reach out, as we'd love to hear from you. So until next time, keep moving forward.